Atari didn't just help start the video game industry, they basically were the gaming industry at one point. From Pong machines to the Jaguar, and even a weird comeback in the 2020s, here's a look at every home console Atari released. The Telegame Pong was Atari's first home console. It didn't play cartridges, just Pong, and that's it. It was sold through Sears under the Telegames name, which makes it sound like a weird knockoff, even though it wasn't. It used simple analog circuitry, no microprocessor, just a bunch of logic chips to display two paddles, a ball, and a score. It connected directly to your TV and only came in black and white. It may not look like much now, but this little box launched home gaming. Before cartridges became standard, Atari released a bunch of dedicated systems. The Video Pinball played pinball games, Breakout, and a version of Pong. It looked more futuristic than most consoles of the time, and actually had a real spring-loaded plunger for launching the ball. Internally, it ran on a custom chip Atari designed themselves. Like Pong, this wasn't programmable. It just did what it was built to do. The Atari stunt cycle was pretty rare. It was based on the arcade game of the same name, and it came in its own molded plastic shell with real handlebars built in. The whole game was about timing your jumps, and the hardware was once again built entirely with logic chips. No cartridge, no CPU, just old school electronic engineering. The Atari 2600 was the big one. This changed everything. It was one of the first consoles to use ROM cartridges, letting you play a whole library of games instead of just one. It used an MOS 6507 CPU, and it only had 128 bytes of RAM. Not kilobytes, not gigabytes, bytes. 128 of them. Graphics and sound were handled by the TIA chip, which forced developers to get super creative. The 2600 stayed on store shelves for over a decade, and became the face of early home gaming. The Atari 5200 was supposed to be the 2600's successor, but it was kind of a mess. It was based on Atari 400-800 computers, and used the same graphics chips. It had much better visuals and sound, but the controller was absolutely awful. It was overly complicated and prone to breaking. Also, it wasn't backward compatible with 2600 games unless you bought a bulky adapter. Even though it was more powerful, most people stuck with the 2600. Atari 7800. After the crash of 1983, Atari needed a comeback. This was meant to be that comeback, and it had some smart ideas. It was fully backward compatible with the 2600, making it the first console in history with full backward compatibility built in. It used a custom graphics chip called the Maria, which could push a lot more sprites onto the screen. But for some reason, it still used the old sound chip, which made it sound not that great. It was delayed for years after being announced, and by the time it came out, the NES had already made it obsolete. The Atari XEGS is an Atari 65XE computer in a console shell. It looked like a sleek white console, but you could plug in a keyboard and use it like a full computer. It played most Atari 8-bit computer games, which meant it had a massive library. It came with a light gun and a copy of the game Bug Hunt. It was a cool idea, but it was too niche to catch on. The Lynx was Atari's first handheld, and it was surprisingly advanced. It had a color screen, a 16-bit processor, and even hardware scaling and rotation, which the Game Boy couldn't even dream of. But it was big, expensive, and ate batteries like candy. It was also hard to find in stores. Despite being massively ahead of its time, it never caught on. The Lynx 2 was a redesigned version of the original Lynx. It was smaller, lighter, and had a better screen. It still had the same power-hungry hardware and limited game support, but it looked and felt more like a real competitor to the Game Boy, even if it wasn't one. The Atari Jaguar is one of the most infamous consoles ever made. Atari marketed it as the first 64-bit system, but the hardware was weird. It had 2 custom processing chips, plus a Motorola chip that handled most of the work. Programming for it was a nightmare with the weird architecture, and the game library was tiny and terrible. It had a massive, confusing controller, and launched with very few good games. Despite the hype, the Jaguar flopped hard. But then, in 2021, decades later, Atari kind of made a comeback. The Atari VCS is a modern, retro-inspired console that runs Linux or Windows. It plays indie games and streaming apps, and can also be used like a full gaming PC, albeit a not very powerful one. It looks like a modern take on the 2600, and includes a throwback wireless joystick, but it's more of a novelty than a serious game system, and reviews were mixed. Atari helped start it all, and in some ways, they never stopped experimenting. While Sega and Nintendo became household names, Atari kind of just faded into the past. But if you're into retro tech and unusual hardware, Atari consoles are huge surprises. Thanks for watching, everyone. Subscribe to Byte for more documentaries like this. Have a great day.